So I ask you, what's in your wallet? What's in your wallet? How many times a day are we asked that question? What's in your wallet? I think before breakfast, I'm asked it 3 times by Samuel L. Jackson. Yeah. You know, and when I watch the morning news shows, I hear that question, and I'm also inundated with commercials about financial planning companies about, filling my storehouses, and is my storehouse big enough for my golden years? Once a quarter, I get a statement from the Board of Pensions how much is in my storehouse, and how much I have to live on, and what I could do to increase my storehouse. So it's a question, that we live with. That we live with. How big is what's in our storehouse? And do we need a bigger storehouse? And is it big enough? So Jesus tells this parable, and it's a drama about greed. And he says, watch out. Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. So there's apparently there are different kinds of greed. And then he goes on to say, because after all, a person's life is not determined by their possessions, even if they are very wealthy. So he tells this drama about greed, and there are, I'm going to say, 4 roles that a person can play. And I'm just going to go through the 4 roles in this drama about greed. The first role is played by a person called someone. Someone in the crowd came up to Jesus. Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Someone doesn't ask Jesus. Someone tells Jesus. That means he's got the answer. He knows what Jesus should say, and he wants Jesus just to back him up. Jesus, be on my side. Now, when I was a district superintendent, I learned to beware of people who came up to me and said to me, John, tell my minister to do this. Sometimes ministers get caught in, John, tell my wife to do this. Tell my husband to do this. Tell my partner to do this. And I've discovered that usually the person only tells me the part of the story that makes them look good. Yeah. And Jesus demurs here. He says, I'm not going to answer your question. I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. Jesus backs off. Now, I hope I remember by the end of the sermon to tell you why I think Jesus doesn't respond to this guy. Divide the inheritance. The Bible can be read as a book about brothers. There's Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. There's the brothers in the prodigal son story. There's Peter and Andrew. There's James and John. And so often, these stories about brothers, there's friction. And there's often friction between them about the inheritance. That's the friction between Jacob and Esau. And let's face it, when there's an inheritance, often there is friction within a family. Now, in the late 80s, the last of the Keeny siblings died of my father's generation, and my sister and I and a cousin we didn't know who lived in Florida inherited the Keeny estate. And the last Keeny had died in probate, so it was determined by the lawyer that we had hired that the property would be divided 3 ways. And that was fine with all of us because we saw the inheritance as grace. We weren't anticipating. It was just a gift to us that we didn't deserve. So anything we got for us was icing on the cake. So the inheritance didn't cause friction. But the estate did cause friction. there was a neighbor who, on occasion, looked after the last surviving Keeny on the farm. And the lawyer got a registered letter saying that this man had looked after my uncle for 15 years, and he deserved a cut of the estate because of his Christian charity. Do you want to know what Christian charity was worth per year in 1989? $1,000. He claimed 15 years of Christian charity. And my sister and I just said, what the heck? I mean, we weren't anticipating this money anyway. Let him have it. And so there was no argument. We just let him have it. But I was interested that, was he interested in justice? Was he interested in fairness? Or was it greed that he wanted the cut of the Keeny estate? Sometimes these arguments for justice are really just a masquerade for give me mine, give me mine. I think that's another reason why Jesus didn't want to get involved in this debate between brothers. Now, if you had this role, how would you play this role of someone? How would you play someone? I think I'd play someone as anxious, as a shade greedy. I think I'd play them a little self-righteous, a little angry, and a little bitter. Give me mine. The second role is played by a person who calls himself self. Self. Self talks to himself a lot. Doesn't talk to anybody else, he just talks to himself. This whole parable that Jesus tells, self just talks to himself. Now, self has had a windfall. It says his land produced bountifully. And he doesn't know what to do with all his bounty other than to build bigger storehouses. It doesn't enter his mind to do anything else with his bounty other than to build bigger storehouses. I read the statistics in my devotions from the upper room, so it must be true, that in the last 6 years, the average new house that's been built has 1,000 more square feet than it did in 2010. And the average number of people living in these houses has gone down by almost one person in the last 6 years. So you have bigger houses and fewer people. For stuff. What do you do when you have more stuff? You get a pod. You get a storage shed. What else can you do with it? You clog up your basements and attics. The guy didn't know what else to do with this stuff, so he built bigger warehouses. Now, what's interesting in this parable is it says the land produced for this man. It never enters his mind to be thankful for the land, to be thankful for the weather, to be thankful for the dirt. It never enters his mind to be thankful to God. There's no hint of gratitude in here. Psalm 107 is a beautiful psalm. Give praise to the Lord, for the Lord has provided. The guy doesn't say that. What else could he have done with this bountiful harvest? He could have given it to the poor. St. Augustine says, the stomachs of the poor are a better warehouse for this crop. He didn't listen to Psalm 107 again, where it says, oh, give your bounty to the poor and the hungry. What this guy has done is cut himself off from God and cut himself off from his neighbor. He's eliminated God and his neighbor from his life. And that's why when he talks so much, he only talks to himself because there's nobody else to talk to. And he says, now that I've got this big warehouse, I can relax, eat, drink, and be merry. With whom? With whom is he going to eat, drink, and be merry? And then it says relax. Can this kind of guy ever relax? Will his storehouse ever be big enough? Will there ever be enough in his wallet? Will there ever be enough in his pension plan? How do you play this guy? How do you play this guy's role? Self. How do you play self's role? Rich, anxious, rich, alone, rich, protective. Third character in the play is God. God has a very small role, only one line. You know, this is the line you'd want, you know, if you wanted to break into theater. Fool. These things demand your life tonight. You know, God is an unwelcome guest in this man's life, in this story. You know, God interrupts the party, or God interrupts a good night's sleep. Fool. These things demand your life tonight. Jesus, the man's name has changed from self to fool. According to God, he's a fool. Why? These things demand your life tonight. His possessions have come to possess him. His life is owned by what he thinks he owns. He is a slave to his things. When I was at the monastery, one of the monks told me this story. And he said there was a research institution that offered a bounty of $5,000 for a living wolf that could be researched and studied. So these college students decided to go up to Alaska and make $5,000 per wolf. So they went up for summer break and thought, we can finance our college through capturing wolves. So one night, Tom and Dave were sleeping in the woods in their sleeping bags, and Dave woke up and he looked around him, and there were 20 wolves around them with their teeth bared and their eyes, glaring at these two guys. And he said, Tom, wake up! Wake up! We're rich! They were soon to be devoured by their riches. Fool, your things own you and run your life. How would you play this role? How would you play God? Do you say it angrily, fool, fool? Or do you just go, oh, fool, don't you see? Don't you see that you're a slave? You've sold yourself. You're not free. You're owned by your things. Fourth role are the disciples, the people to whom Jesus told the story. Jesus ends the parable by saying, this is how it is for those who hoard their possessions and are not rich toward God. Jesus doesn't tell them how to be. He just describes. And I think this is why he doesn't answer the question or the demand of someone, tell my brother to divide the inheritance. He tells this parable because he figures someone can figure it out, what he should do with the inheritance. Jesus told this parable, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. For a person's life isn't determined by their possessions. You know, whenever the minister talks about money in the church, and this is a stewardship sermon on a hot, rainy day, and you thought, why did I come to get a stewardship sermon? It's usually that the minister doesn't have any business talking about money, talking about my money, talking about my inheritance, what I own. And sometimes I start to sound, when people talk that way to me, I start to sound like the fool saying, God, you have no business in my life. Neighbor, you have no business in my life. It's mine, and I'll do with it what I want. I think Jesus is saying to us, we're already slaves. We've sacrificed our life. It isn't that we sacrifice our money in giving to God and giving to our neighbor. We've already sacrificed our life by being owned by our possessions. Jesus is saying, don't sacrifice your life. Don't be a slave. Don't let something run your life. And often our wealth and our possessions do. He says, you have a choice. You have a choice to be a slave, to sacrifice your life, or to be rich toward God. I like it how he phrases this, rich toward God. We don't use that kind of language. Toward God means a movement. You're moving toward God. We move toward God, and that's how we're rich. And how do we move toward God? Well, in these passages that surround this one, there's first the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan sees his neighbor and takes care of his neighbor and gives the innkeeper money to care for his neighbor. He sees his neighbor where the fool didn't see his neighbor. That's how one's rich toward God. Before this story is also the story of Mary and Martha. How Mary sits at Jesus' feet and listens to Jesus' teachings, focuses on Jesus. The fool didn't do that. One who is rich toward God focused on Jesus' teachings. Immediately after this, Jesus talks about sell your possessions, sell the surplus, and give to the poor. That's moving richly toward God. After that, he tells the parable of the prodigal son, where the older brother is to accept his younger brother and forgive him. That's moving toward God and being rich toward God. One is rich toward God by including God and being grateful. One is rich toward God by including one's neighbor in one's possessions, thereby being freed from being a slave to things. So the choice is up to us, and the question is either what's in your wallet or who's in your life?